Yes. First, some background on this one. This is a talk about a DevOps transition that is a sharp cut. If you're here to learn about internal DevOps transition, convincing internal people to change their ways, you'll get some out of this, but this is not necessarily aimed at you. This is aimed at two different populations. Those of you who are in sort of big IT and are looking to move on to perhaps something more startup-y and want to kind of break out of that old mold, go join this bright new world of DevOps and not having to deal with all the politics of the big company and doing that and surviving that move, which I actually got fired for once because that's my pain sharing you. And the other population, which is the people out there who are tech leads or managers who may be dealing with those of us who are moving into their groups. So both of those populations should get something out of here, just to set that off right off at the top. But some background, yes, when I moved from big IT to my first startup, it was okay for a few years, but there are a bunch of cultural little things that I didn't quite pick up on, little habits I kept with me as I moved into my new role that caused me to get fired because, well, there's a few reasons. One of them which was I was perceived to be an asshole. I was an asshole rule fire. This is a real thing, and the problem is that among this group, my people here in this hall, I'm fine. It's great. I get along with you guys great, but when I get around software engineers, the humor doesn't go as well. And it kind of goes because there's this gulf. You know, the traditional IT service structure is service-based. You know, do things for other parts of the organization for those other parts. Experts charged with keeping things running, but have to ask others to approve any improvements. Versus this, across this ocean, this sort of startup land over there, that's this generative organization where you create a product, one, sometimes amazing, not 50, make it better in collaboration with the entire group, experts working in a group to keep things running and continually improve them. Different mission statements, you know, it's attractive, but I didn't quite get what working in that organization really meant. And it took a while, and taking another tour back into big IT to see what the failure modes are. And it all comes down to something we saw earlier this year. You've seen this mentioned a couple of times this session. Nicole did it. Google posted this study earlier today about psychological safety. And that was in a study about what is the one thing that makes an effective team. And it turns out the one thing that makes an effective team is if all the team members feel safe being in that group. And that's an interesting question because when you get to this chart, which we've seen a lot, the Westrum typology, psychological safety means different things for pathological organizations, bureaucratic organizations, and generative organizations. Because, you know, pathologic, as you see novelty crush, failures lead to scapegoating, it's very power-based, and in order to participate in getting anything done, you have to play the power games. And how you stay safe and try to push through change that will make your life better is a very different thing than when you have to do it, say, like in a generative organization. And if you've come out of pathological and actually been successful at it, you see pathological behaviors in bureaucratic and generative, even though it's not actually there. And that really trips you up. Generative organizations, rules-based stuff, that's statistically, most of us have spent a lot of time in there since, as Nicole pointed out this morning, that's what big business is. It's all about rules. So what you do to stay safe there, coalition build, huddle down and just sort of stop caring after a little while if it just gets too much weather. It doesn't work so good. But here's the thing for ops. Little makes for a toxic environment faster than being a highly trained person with professional standards and no one listens to you. The microaggressions, all the microaggressions, it is a big problem. To start off with, I want to talk about an example where many of us started, Helpdesk. Because we call this Helpdesk for a very good reason, because we're surrounded by people who are not exactly good at what they do. That's the polite term. And it starts with the people you're directly supporting. And this is the nice range of things like the malware installs that keep happening on certain systems, even though you keep telling them how to avoid the certain sites that get this stuff. Mr. Helpful was almost always a Mr., the power user who helps optimize the machines in their particular group that you have to de-optimize and make functional again repeatedly. Unauthorized VPNs, because we can tell that sort of bypassing of the acceptable use policy. Thank you very much. Networking is pretty good these days. Phishing failures, you have to go talk to people about, listen, this is what a phishing message is, and now you have to change your password. DMCA notices, please don't BitTorrent on the company network, please. And porn collections when you're doing system work, because that's fun to run into. So yes, all these little things that lead to those great stories that help desk people talk about, and we talk about in the hallways. But it doesn't stop there. The people beside us. Now this is one of the unspoken of truths about how sysadmin teams work in large organizations. And the other unspoken truth is that we have standards, we have professional standards, but they're not codified in concrete anywhere. So my professional standards and those bozos over there who don't know how to perform a backup correctly, we both think each other is not doing something correctly and are incompetent bozos, but we still have to work with them because we're all part of the major organization. And that malware system that I had to keep going back to a user to deal with their laptop, the reason I'm at that machine is because that is a Mac that keeps getting malwared, and it's not my user. It actually belongs to the incompetent bozos over there. I have to keep happy in the sysadmin coordination meetings. So I'm going over there as a favor because they can't be arsed enough to figure out how to maintain their fleet. Okay, but it doesn't stop there. Up there in management, after all this time, dealing with all the malware problems on the Mac fleet, I decide to sit down, okay, I'm going to write a business proposal and push it up the line to management. We need some anti-malware software for the Macintosh. It's all about numbers, so I'm going to make it in the language that business loves, and that is money. So we can save 3 times as much money as I am expending every year on the sunk time dealing with all these images just by getting some software. Please, management, make it happen. And they consider and they come down with, Macintosh is such a small portion of our fleet, it is not worth our time for this particular expense. Denied. So, as you have it at all sides, there is one thing that really is there for you. All sides, and that is your team of awesome. Your team. You're there in the trenches. You are the thin line between the duct tape infrastructure and the chaos monkeys that will wreck it. Your team of awesome is what keeps you sane, because your coworkers, the ones you work with every day, they're the ones that you know. You know that whenever they bring up an idea, it's probably a good idea and it does take into account everything. And this sort of siege mentality of we are the only thing keeping this running drives a lot of the pathologies that we run into. But it's not necessarily just helpdesk. It's also in those of us who are working more of a sysadmin role, more of an integration role. And now we have an org chart, flow chart. This one may bring some nightmares to some of you. This is the service-oriented architecture for IT as a service. An example thing here. So some business unit somewhere decides they have a business need, and they decide to fix it by finding some suppliers, and then qualify suppliers against the business need. They go to management to say, we'd like to do this thing. Management says, okay, here's your budget. And then this other business unit picks their suppliers, and they walk up to the IT service deck and say, hi, here's $60,000 worth of SAP licenses, $40,000 worth of hardware. We need it in 3 months. Thanks. And we sit there going, how did this show up? If you're extremely lucky, you may have that step in there, IT review, possibly after management. But all too often what that is just management saying there's enough room in the ops organization's schedule to be able to deal with a deploy of this size this quarter or next quarter. It might be technical review. That'd be great. But if you're sitting down there at the deliver to IT for deployment and you've got a boondoggle on your desk staring you in the face saying, this is going to be a bad problem, there's something that happens at this point, and that's when you have to juggle chainsaws. And the problem here is when you're juggling chainsaws, you don't necessarily take well to people juggling your elbow. Here, add this chainsaw, it's badly balanced, but I'm sure you'll work it out. No, my hand will get cut off. I'm not going to do this. And you just start throwing all these no, stop signs, because reflexive change resistance is how we work. That chart we saw here, we are the last step before it goes into the infrastructure. We are the last line of defense. And us saying, no, we can't do this is the good kind of problem for the organization, or so we tell ourselves. Because by pushing back at this stage, we can possibly cause people to reassess. Maybe this boondoggle on our desk, all licensing is negotiable. We all know this if you've been in the industry long enough. We can go back and perhaps jigger our options we pick up. Perhaps maybe we need to pick up an HA option, which they didn't pick in before, assuming we could just sort of magically HA this, whatever it was, and do some other things and perhaps maybe make it slightly more acceptable, and we can probably deflect the asteroid from merely smattering us instead of maybe of a glancing blow. Maybe deal with some outages for a while as we integrate this thing. But yeah, we survive, that's what we do. We try to keep things from falling apart, but sometimes that doesn't always work. And that leads to intentional de-investment, because if you pitch a fit and say, we can't do this, and management says, tough, deal with it, you're sort of, okay, well, great, I'll give you exactly what you want. That's what that'll show you. But those of you who laugh have thought this at some point, and that's kind of what I'm getting to, because this sort of intentional de-investment is a cynical shield that you put before yourself to try to hide the damage, because you've just been told to do something you know is going to cause you pain, and you just got told do it anyway. So what you do is you try to separate yourself from the pain you know is going to come, because deploy projects like this always fail. We all know this. Not actually, but it feels that way. And so, yes, to save my sanity, I no longer care how this turns out. Don't care. And the next one is compartmentalization. You have your team of awesome. You may be the sysadmins, but there are other groups in your organization that you don't necessarily consider incompetent bozos because they're not in your area. Perhaps they're the networking group or maybe the database administrators. They get handled a boondoggle of their own, and they're being steamrolled by management, and rather than going over there and helping them through the problem, you pat them on the back, say, I feel you, exchange a few war stories to kind of handshake that everybody's sort of in the same boat here, chuckle about it and walk off. Because there's not enough time or sanity left in your life to deal with their problems as well as your own. So you kind of bring that wall back to your own team of awesome. But you have sympathy. You may talk about it over beers, but it doesn't all go everywhere. And the kind of last point I want to talk about here is the fourth method is bonding through negativity. Pain shared is pain divided. This is the stupid user trick. This is the BOFH. This is the loser, this is an acronym I haven't seen recently, but have definitely out there. The pointy-haired boss. The sort of self-deprecating and intentionally cruel humor sometimes that we point at the people that are causing us pain, like the users you're supporting, the incompetent bozos in your peer departments, or the management that rejected your whatever it is because they're not thinking straight, and other less happy words. And sysadmin humor is kind of gallows humor at times, and it has a good side and bad side. Alice mentioned this morning about the gallows humor that we all enjoy, but sometimes it can turn cruel, and that cruel part's bad. This is the good stuff, a lot of us are subscribed to these Twitter feeds because, it's funny. This hangs a hat on a lot of the failures in the big IT marketplace. And as a way to try to deal with this trauma we're being inflicted with all day, every day, yes, these are funny, honest status update, stat server, stat operator, these are all good stuff. But there comes a time when it's not just us that does this, by the way. We're not the only profession that has this sort of surrounded by people who are doing not bright things. Police, firefighters, ER professionals, animal control officers. I've hung around all four of these people before, and they all have a certain, very familiar to us, opinion on war stories and their general view of the public. Police, they have to deal with domestic problems and people screaming at each other and shooting each other when they really shouldn't be doing it. Firefighters are like, you lit what on fire? ER professionals, you cut what off? And animal control officers, you did what to the dog? You may laugh at that, but animal control officers, of the five of us and these four, are probably the ones that have the hardest problem, because they deal with people who are intentionally cruel to animals. And one example I will give is an animal control officer I spoke with got called out to a call. They got a call that a bunch of people are sitting on a porch with a dog in a garbage bag. Why? So he walks up and says, why is there a dog in the garbage bag? That dog ain't looking too good. And the people around the porch said, dog's about to die anyway, figured it'd save on cleanup. And that ended up in a animal cruelty charge. I can't say where it went, but that's the kind of thing these people face all day, every day. And it's humbling to hear these stories, but how they deal with it is the same as the way we deal with it, because it's one of the innate, natural human ways of dealing with these sorts of trauma you deal with day in and day out. Very familiar. But there comes a time when you say, I've had enough. Traditional IT, service organization, a toxic cesspit of disrespect and things I hate, and this generative organization, this wonderland of promise and not hating my job. And the input into this bridge across this ocean between them has been software as a service. Because over the last 15 years, software as a service has nibbled away ever more into the core services of IT. And those of us who are in big IT right now and have been for 15 years have seen this happen. 15 years ago, a lot of our job was rack and stack, buy a bunch of hardware, try to get the new software and integrate the whole thing into our existing infrastructure and figure out the data flows, which may or may not be us, but we definitely involved with it. But for software as a service, all the rack and stack and integration stuff is not doing much anymore. But these days, you're doing far more scripting, trying to translate the import, manage the user accounts in front of this new software as a service product so you can single sign on that. That is something that small startups are beginning to fight these days. If it doesn't integrate with Google, we don't use it, is what a lot of them do. But if you're a 20 or 40-year-old organization, you may have your own Active Directory on board, or you may even have something else that has to be integrated. And we still have to work with, how do we front the authentication to this? Or maybe we have to import user lists. How do we do role-based authentication in whatever this new system is? All this sort of systems work that we're doing these days, it's changed the nature of our jobs, even in big IT over the last so long. And it makes you wonder, I'm doing Jenkins works these days. I may have Vagrant installed. I'm using Packer to do some stuff. And that's what these generative organizations are. Maybe I could get a job over there and sort of put away all this disrespect that I'm dealing with. And so magic happens. You go job hunting and say, yay, new job. And because you've been good in meetings, you start on your first day, you get your first laptop, and cool. And you go through your developer onboarding because you're kind of a developer at this point for a new DevOps job because you're in a small agile team. And you do the onboarding, and it's a whole wave of new because you've never been treated like a developer before, which is kind of what most DevOps are when they're first onboarded, unless it's a stealth ops team, in which case it's very familiar, and what I'm talking about doesn't matter. But in my case, I was the first native ops hire they ever had. And I've seen this pathology too, when it's like the first or second and they're kind of in different areas, or you're the first ops person on a specific agile team. The mindset differences are. And for the first 4, 6 weeks, you're still figuring out where the Post-it notes are, how to commit code, how the infrastructure is all put together. You see some concerning things about how they're putting up. You have opinions about what could be made better, but you're new. You're not really ready to start raising a hue and cry yet. And then it happens. In a stand-up meeting, or possibly a sprint planning meeting, someone says something big. We need to replace the Redis server with an AQMP solution because we need the feedback loops. And then you get the problem, which is the reflective change resistance, because this is a big issue. And that's also one of the things they don't necessarily tell you about when they're talking about agile, is that not all changes are small and incremental. This one looks like a developer walked in and said, yeah, let's just rip out a core infrastructure service and put a new one in, whatever. And you know how you respond to that in big IT? No. What are you smoking? What's going on here? But you're new here, so you just do that flat no. No, we can't do that. Simply cannot do that. We are not ready for this. And you bring the sprint planning process to a complete and total stop. And that's very unfamiliar to the software engineering side. We did this, if you remember that org chart, because we are the last line of defense before it actually goes into production. What the person who throws that big fat no has not internalized yet is that you're now back up way at the beginning of the chart of identify providers. You're at the beginning where you wanted to be all along. You just haven't learned you're doing it yet. So with this, Agile is far more of an improv process. We've had improv workshops here at this conference for a few years now for very good reasons, because it follows the similar rules. When you throw a flat no out into a scene, everybody sort of blinks and wonders how to pick up the scene again because all the momentum is lost. And this is where, I'm going to change venue a little bit here. This is where the team leaders and managers of that group begin to start showing their stuff. Because when you have somebody who's thrown a flat no in this collaborative process, how you respond matters very much so. The good ones will start asking questions, start drawing the question. Okay, I see you're very impressed. I see you're very involved in this one. And what challenges are you seeing? Okay, that's very good. We can make some user stories on that one, perhaps flesh this epic out some more. Let's make some user stories. Can you work with the person who proposed it on that one? I think that good work. And what this does is it starts programming this ops refugee into thinking that perhaps maybe flat no isn't good, but no but may be more acceptable, which is on the way to yes and, which is where you want them to get. Yes and takes a long time. I've been doing this for 4.5 years now, and I still have trouble reaching for yes and every time someone proposes a big change. The reflexive no is still there. It's hard to deprogram. So yes, but sometimes this doesn't always happen. Sometimes the team leaders knew. This is very common in startups. The team leader's often a senior engineer that got promoted into management and started doing it half-time. They may not have done management before. So instead of, okay, that's very interesting, this sort of interrogative process, they do think in their head, that's conflict. I don't know how to deal with conflict. So they just sort of blink and say, okay, we're not doing that move again, and move the meeting on to the next topic and bring the person who brought this huge swap upwards, because that's been on the roadmap for a while. If you're growing something, you know you're going to have to make some move like that at some point. What the developer proposed it did was just say, now is the time. So bring it off. They work on the user stories the way it would have been if the new person hadn't been there. And a week later or 2 weeks later, when the next meeting comes up, it's on the agenda again, and it's been fleshed out. So you get into the other problem, which is the investment in compartmentalization, because at this point, the ops refugee will say, I see. Apparently so-and-so, the leader and the developer have a special relationship, and they're not listening to me. So whatever, I'm done. This is the hard problem of leading a team here, because this is a negative signal. If somebody on your team has been passionate about something and suddenly shuts up, the novice manager will say, oh, thank God, they stopped yelling, and just sort of ignore it. But the manager who's paying attention, or the team leader who's paying attention, will say, okay, passion suddenly disinvested. Something happened. Ask them about it. What's going on? Ask them, walk up, because one thing those of us in operations love is being asked our opinion, because it happens so seldom, for real, in the old infrastructure. So you walk up and say, what's going on? And you'll get a nice readout, and you go back to that script I had. Okay, that's good. We can reuse those user stories. Why don't you work with this other person? We can flesh out the epic and start re-engaging them and get them. This is all part of the retraining process, because it goes both ways. Those of you who've listened to me talk about this can start seeing this in yourself and start seeing the way things work and how you can make it better as you move through. But for the managers who are dealing with this, you have to make an effort too, because it kind of goes both ways, which is why I talk to both. So sometimes, but there's one other thing we haven't spoken of, and that's the humor. Bonding through negativity. This would probably happen during the 4 to 6 weeks before the great stand-up debacle. And that is trying to make friends. And one way that someone who's a bit insecure about how this whole organization works, you can make friends through the way you've made friends throughout your entire career, and that is to throw a few stupid user stories out, see what user stories you get back, have a good laugh, slap each other on the back, and have that feeling of camaraderie. Doesn't always work, especially with software people, because software people, for the most part, are optimists. It's not necessarily stupid user tricks, it's more features that didn't quite work out, or other things. Bagging on management is a common pastime if you've been bagged on yourself, but not always, especially in a small organization. That sort of thing gets noticed more often, and that gets you labeled as asshole very quickly. And the fix for that is quite simple. Check that shit. You really need to signpost this in your culture, especially for those of you who are team leaders. If you're dealing with people coming from diverse backgrounds, and diverse can also be more than just diverse in identity, but diverse in cultural background in terms of corporate. Because if you're a generative environment, dealing with the people who came back from a bureaucratic or a psychological, a pathological environment, their reflexes may not be correct, and you need to set clear boundaries on this one. Signpost your office culture. That is not acceptable. Say it explicitly. Do not try to coach it in sort of passive-aggressive Midwestern, which a lot of people would do for those of you in the middle. do not try to post it to everybody in the group. We've had some problems with some coarse language today, people. We should probably cut it down. No, set them off to the side. You are having a problem with coarse language. Stop it. This is not acceptable. That sends an unambiguous signal to the person that there is a line of cross they have crossed, and that there is a line there. This is worth it, because at this point, the people who say, oh, back off, and okay, realize, thank you for the hard check, yank of the leash, and they start correcting their behavior, they can be taught. That person is someone who is an adapted asshole. A lot of us are adapted assholes in our specific contexts. And there's a reason we earn reputations for being hard to work with by outside, because of that reflexive change resistance, that big no we throw up back at our old organizations that were so hard on us. And that's not good. But the people who say, okay, PC asshole, and start doing it more or try to escalate, those are your true assholes, and you can safely fire them with a good conscience. So pay attention to that and don't put up with this sort of negativity in your organizations. And you, the tech lead or manager, will have a better time integrating with those people who are actively trying to adapt. They just need some more signposting. So one other slide. This came from RailsConf early last month from Kinsey and Durham about ways to not be an asshole. And I brought this up specifically because of some of the ways that sysadmins tend to talk about and to people they consider to be end users. That's word choices. Try to avoid condescension. I mean, we've been harping on this for a long time, but definitely be aware of it, especially if you're surrounded by software engineers. Pay attention to the words you're using. Look at your body language. Are you dismissive in body language? You just sort of talk and don't listen, or are you actively listening and paying attention, making eye contact, and trying to signal that you value this person's input? Always encouraging. We have trouble with this. We're always encouraging to our team of awesome, but we're not so good about always being encouraging for the developers who are proposing changes. The thing to remember is that in these generative organizations, especially if you're in a DevOps team, you're at the beginning of that flowchart. You're not at the end anymore. This is the point where you want to encourage them to perhaps pursue different avenues, not flat deny it and hope the grown-ups figure out that was a bad choice and decide something else. You are into the grown-ups now. So, and do not be condescending, because all this goes into condescending. This is a great slide. So this is 3 different steps to follow for dealing with it. And first one, especially as a technical manager, is redirect. Turn the reflexive negativity, the big flat no, into an opportunity to provide feedback. Because that continues the retraining process of okay, I can actually contribute here. Instead of just being quiet and exploding out your opinion once you see the decision's been made, actually this will start making us more comfortable with submitting our opinion earlier in the process and being willing to collaborate on the process rather than stop it. Because collaboration is what Agile is all about. Re-engage. So after something, if they are very negative about something and decide it doesn't happen, just try to bring them back into the fold, because recovering from a loss healthily is a very different thing in both pathologic, bureaucratic, and generative environments. Recovering from a loss in a pathologic environment means shutting the hell up and proving you're still on side. That is a toxic environment. You don't want to work in them, and most people try to get out. In bureaucratic environments, being suffered a loss is something that happens a lot. You just sort of shrug and forget about it and move on, the compartmentalization. In a generative environment, it's far more about those feedback loops they're talking about. It's when you deal with a loss in a generative environment, it's more about learning from where you missed it so you can improve your mental model of what counts as acceptable. And so you can better predict what acceptable will look like and propose solutions that will fit that mold. And of course, stop hurtful negativity. Negativity is a survival instinct when you're dealing with pathological and bureaucratic environments, especially in pathologic, because everybody expects a little of that. Bureaucratic, not so much, but it's kind of a side effect of being a service-oriented architecture right at the implementer stage. But it's not good in generative environments. It's very much actively harmful. And you probably have seen a lot of stuff surrounding what's good and bad in cultures, and this is a big difference in them, just within the hue of corporate culture. So check that stuff and fire the assholes who don't adapt. So I have time for some questions. Any company culture problems you may be having? Maybe you're a team leader who's having some trouble dealing with some new people. I'll certainly help deal with that. Yeah, we have someone.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed the talk. Would you have any resources for teams that are interested in kind of adopting this culture, or especially teams when they're trying to maybe recommend it as a kind of a management style that the team takes on?
Okay, that's getting into the internal transformation, and that has its own strategies. I spent quite a lot of time in mostly bureaucratic, so I got pretty good at coalition building. And that's, again, statistically what most people have ended up in over time. But whenever you need to change a corporate culture in a bureaucratic environment, you need to get buy-in from multiple levels. Because once you have that buy-in, then you can actually get the change forced down. Because in those bureaucratic ones, it's a lot about this needs to happen from 2 levels up. Because your boss can be ignored. Your grand boss is an act of God. And if you can get your grand boss on side saying this is going to happen, then it's far more likely to actually push it through and keep the managerial backbone stiffened to maybe change the internal culture. I don't have any true resources on that one because it's a lot of social engineering, quite frankly. I know it's a security concept, but it totally works in management. I've used it for ages. So hope that helps.
Any other questions? Thank you, Jamie.
All right, thank you.